Thanks, everyone. I'm just going to get this set up. So thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many people here. That's great. I can hear myself now. So I thought I would start, although many of us might not want to, by casting our minds back to last week's ferocious heat wave, right? So during last week's heat wave, as we all know, cities all around Europe, including London and Paris, smashed their historical records for combined temperature and humidity. And many of us, and I know I did, really struggled to cope, right? But especially the youngest and oldest, who are the most likely to get acutely heat stressed or even tragically to die during heat waves. And as the planet is warming, right, direct exposure to these kinds of heat extremes is becoming more and more common, and it's making it really obvious to all of us inside our own bodies, right, that the climate crisis is in fact a health crisis. But climate change is coupled with biodiversity loss, and these two things are transforming our health in so many other ways as well. And many of these are much stealthier, but they're no less profound. So, my name is Rory Gibb. I'm an ecologist and epidemiologist at UCL. And my goal today really is to convince you that we should be paying more attention to how climate change is impacting infectious diseases. But I thought I'd begin with a brief recap of the fundamentals here, right? So climate change is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, principally from the burning of fossil fuels, but also from animal agriculture, deforestation, and land conversion, which are also having catastrophic impacts on wildlife. And worldwide, this accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is causing the global temperature to rise, right? As we can see in this graph, at frankly a pretty scary rate, right? We're looking at a speed that's faster than any time in at least the last 800,000 years. But what each of us experiences locally, right, where we actually live, has, I think, more elegantly been described not as global warming, but as global weirding, right? So things are getting hotter for sure, but things are also getting more and more extreme, and they're getting more unpredictable. So we're seeing more heat waves like last week. We're seeing more prolonged and deep droughts, or we're seeing more extreme rainfall at unusual times. All of these have impacts on us as people, but they're also severely impacting the many animals, plants, and ecosystems that we share the planet with, many of which are already under extreme stress from this cocktail of pollution and habitat loss and extractive industry. And so what this means is that actually populations of many wildlife species have declined by up to 50% or more since the 1970s. And now, as the planet's heating up, many species are actually on the move. They're moving around the planet to track the climates they're accustomed to and ending up in new places. So the research that I do at UCL focuses on really what does this weirding of the Earth's climate and ecosystems mean for infectious disease? And the more we study this, the more we learn that infections are actually another way that we feel in our bodies the impacts of the climate and ecological crisis. And these connections might not always be immediately obvious, right? So I guess my goal today really is to focus mainly on the why, to tell you a bit about why is it that we think that infections can be so sensitive to changes in the environment and changes in biodiversity. And then I'll tell you a bit about the how, so how scientists like me study what these things are doing, what's happening here, and why that's important. Trying to explain all diseases everywhere is clearly going to be too much for a 20-minute talk, right? So really my goal here instead is to tell you this story through the lens of one familiar, irritating little creature, and to take us down from this planetary picture that I've painted of crisis to a scale that's much easier to grasp, my little garden in East London during last week's heat wave. And here I am. So I'm sitting in my garden one evening after the temperature had hit 35, and in true scientific tradition, I've decided to use myself as a guinea pig. So I sit down in my garden and I count over a 10-minute period how many mosquitoes attempt to bite me. And what I find is I start picking them off my leg, right? And so what we're seeing here is the main species that's biting me while I'm out there. I counted 16 attempts from this little critter. It's called Culex pipiens, and here's one that I caught in my daughter's bug pot. I think maybe this video will work. Yeah. And this one is a female, right? And we know it's a female because only the females bite us, right? They need the high protein content from vertebrate blood to produce their eggs. But this species is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? So if I ask many of you in this room what you know about mosquitoes, many of you will probably say you know they spread diseases, right? And lots of people might mention malaria, right? So malaria is spread by this group of mosquitoes called Anopheles, so this one up on the top right up here. But there are actually hundreds of blood-feeding mosquito species all around the world, and they're found all the way from the tropics to the Arctic Circle. So I guess the question you might be asking yourselves is, why would I be putting myself through this discomfort for science, right? You know, what lessons about environmental change and disease can we learn from paying close attention to mosquitoes? And the first thing is that we can learn something important about humans' position within the wider web of life. So some mosquito species absolutely love to bite humans, and they actively seek us out. But I can tell you something important about this species in my garden and many others around the world. They don't only bite humans, and many of them don't often bite humans. In fact, this particular species actually prefers to feed on birds. So this very mosquito, which I caught off my leg and put in a pot, right, just before it bit me, this might recently have bitten a nearby sparrow or a nearby blackbird or a magpie, right? And if that bird happened to be carrying a certain type of virus, it might also have managed to transfer that virus from the bird to me. So female mosquitoes bite multiple times during their life cycle, so you can think of them a bit like flying syringes, right? They can kind of move nasty bugs around from person to person or from animal to animal or from animal to person. And this image here is a sort of simplified version of what in scientific terms we'd call a network, where each blob is a species and the connections between them show how we're connected. So I guess what I want to show you here is that this mosquito is acting to connect me, a human, to all of the other species that I share this environment with. And through these connections from blood meal to blood meal, they can share diseases. And so worldwide, mosquitoes play this incredibly important role in connecting up this network of infections between people and non-human animals. So this list is just a small selection of the sort of 80 or so diseases that we know that mosquitoes transmit to people, including viruses that can cause epidemics of infectious arthritis, brain inflammation, and congenital birth defects, really, really nasty things. And what I want you to notice is that these little images by the names of the diseases, these show the main species that host those. And so we can actually see that most of them don't come from humans, they come from other animals. And many of these also present a major threat to human health. So some of you may have heard of dengue fever, for example. This is one of the fastest spreading infectious diseases in the world. There were more than 14 million infections reported in 2024, but that is almost certainly a massive underestimate. This disease spreads really, really quickly by a common urban mosquito that's found throughout the tropics, and it can cause really severe and destabilizing epidemics. And we'll come back to dengue and why it's important a bit later. But I want you to sort of get this sense that the role of mosquitoes in connecting up animals and people is just one example of a much wider phenomenon, which is that about 60% of known human diseases either originate in other animals or they transmit to us regularly from other animals. So the scientific term for these is zoonoses. And some of these infections will transfer to human populations, adapt to us quickly, and then become pandemic threats. So we could think about HIV, which emerged from primates, or the COVID-19 pandemic, during which almost everybody in this room will have been infected by a virus that actually started out inside the body of a bat, right? And so when we look at the data about who shares viruses with who, we get a really clear picture of this. So again, this is a network, like I showed you before. Each blob is an animal group, and the thickness and brightness of the lines shows how many viruses we share in common. And so what you can see is we have humans up here in the top right. We're known to share loads of viruses with lots of other animal groups, right? So this is the first thing that we can learn from paying close attention to mosquitoes. This is that humans are not somehow unique in being separate from nature. We are in fact woven into this intricate web of life in which sort of shared pathogens and diseases is just sort of one facet. And what this also means is that when these webs of life are degraded or unraveled, so when the climate sort of scorches an ecosystem or when a large area of forest is clear-cut for agriculture, this can have knock-on consequences for how diseases spread between animals and people. And just to give you a brief example from some work that I led a few years ago, so we found that worldwide, when natural vegetation, like forests, are converted to agriculture or plantations, actually most mammal species overall do pretty badly. So this is a bar graph showing that mammal species on average decline by about 32%. So most things don't like this. When we look particularly at species that are known to carry human diseases, they actually show the exact opposite pattern. So what is instead happening here is they're increasing in their abundance. So we have more of certain types of birds, bats, and rodents. So what this means, right, is that this sort of degradation of the environment is actually causing the communities of species and their diseases to change, right? They're rewiring these ecological networks, and what that means in some more recent work we've found is that that often leads to a higher outbreak risk for many diseases in people. The second thing that we can learn from paying close attention to mosquitoes takes us back to the influence of climate. So why is climate specifically so important? And from this, I guess we can find a clue in something that we all know intuitively, right? Which is that mosquitoes only tend to bite us, or they tend to bite us most frequently when it's hot and humid, right? So I repeated my garden experiment over a few nights during the heat wave to see what would happen. As you can see, I've got some bites on my legs up there. And what I found is that generally I was getting around 14 bites a night, right? So 14 bite attempts a night, just in my garden in London. Sadly, I can't show you the results from the last couple of nights when it was much cooler because I had to submit these slides to the Royal Society before I got them, so they're hot off the press. But what I can tell you is on the cooler nights when the temperatures were more in the teens than the 20s, they dropped down to sort of 2 or 3 bite attempts in a 10-minute period. So why might that be? So here's a biological explanation, which is that mosquitoes are ectothermic or cold-blooded. So what that means is that their internal body temperature is the same as the environmental temperature around them. And all of the chemical reactions that happen inside their bodies happen at that temperature. So a good way of thinking about this for any of you who've done like sort of GCSE or even sort of high school level biology is that a mosquito's body is a bit like a test tube in a school science lab when you are doing simple experiments with enzymes. So hopefully many of you might remember this kind of experiment. As you warm up the test tube, what we see is that the rate of enzyme activity increases, as we can see on this graph, up to some kind of optimum temperature, beyond which it gets too hot, and all the proteins in the enzymes start to degrade, and everything falls apart and the reaction stops. So we can basically think about a mosquito's metabolism in response to temperature as doing something very similar to this. And there's some super cool science that's been done by colleagues in the US that have shown that same kind of curve that I showed you that you can generate just in your sort of biology lab at school. Like you can do this for all sorts of different aspects of a mosquito's biology, and they all show this kind of temperature sensitivity where they sort of increase and then decrease. So this ranges everything from how fast they bite to how long they live for to how fast viruses will replicate inside their body. So this is the second thing that we can learn from paying attention to mosquitoes, which is that there's a certain temperature range in which they are particularly abundant, particularly active, and particularly effective at transmitting diseases. And what's really important here is that this differs depending on the mosquito species because of the climates they're naturally adapted to. So if we look at a tropical mosquito, like this guy, Aedes aegypti, who transmits dengue and yellow fever and absolutely loves to feed on humans, these ones tend to perform best at high temperatures, right, well up into the 30s. Whereas if I was to look at these temperate mosquitoes in my garden, they're adapted to a different kind of climate, and they actually do much better at lower temperatures, right, in the sort of 20s. So the diseases we can catch depends on where we are on Earth and what mosquitoes we come into contact with. And what this also means, right, is that as the climate warms in places that were cooler, we can think of it, in theory, as doing something a bit like heating up that test tube, right? You know, where you're starting to make everything go faster. And so here's a sort of simple example of this, where we could imagine a place where the historical temperature range is this kind of blue box, so between about 25 and 27 degrees. What happens as the climate warms, and this pushes up to something more like between sort of 25 and 32 degrees, you could see that actually we could shift from a situation where epidemics weren't really a risk to a situation where they might become a major threat to public health. And we're actually starting to see this theory in action. So this graph here on the left shows the trend in annual summer temperatures in southern France. So I want you to pay attention to the blue line. It's going up, right? Everything is getting warmer. And it's getting particularly warmer since about the late 2000s. And what's really striking is that in that exact same period of time, that last 2 decades, since about 2008, we've seen outbreaks of dengue and chikungunya, So these are diseases that were previously restricted to the tropics, starting to happen across southern Europe, and they're going from being isolated occurrences to annual occurrences. So actually, this kind of test tube idea is what's playing out, right? So as the climate is warming, more and more outbreaks are emerging in places where they weren't before. So let's briefly recap where we've gotten to. So humans and our pathogens are part of a wider web of life. The degradation of ecosystems through climate change and intensive agriculture and things, this changes how diseases can spread between wildlife and people. And secondly, changes in the climate can directly affect how efficiently diseases can spread through impacting the biology of the disease, the pathogens, and also of the species that transmit them. And so I wanted to kind of spend the last few minutes talking about how scientists like me go from this sort of fundamental biological and ecological understanding of how these things transmit towards actually measuring how much climate change and biodiversity loss are impacting diseases in the real world. And as you can imagine, this is much more complex and messy than in the lab, right? Like we somehow need to keep in mind everything from the mosquito, the tiny reactions that are going on inside a mosquito's body, all the way up to like planetary scale patterns of warming and deforestation. And as you can imagine, sort of no one scientist or no one researcher can kind of get a grasp on all of this complexity. Instead, it's something more like the parable of the blind men and the elephant, right? Where each person has a sort of different limited perspective on the problem. So an ecologist or a lab biologist studying mosquitoes might see one thing, an anthropologist studying how humans and wildlife interact might see another, a medical doctor treating cases in a hospital might see another. And what makes this such an exciting scientific field is that actually to tackle and understand this challenge properly, we need to bring all of these perspectives together, right? So we need sort of true teamwork across disciplines and also across international borders. But so personally, the question that really excites me as a scientist, like what I do, is how do we take this sort of fundamental understanding I've told you about, like the biology and the ecology of how these things transmit. How do we take that information and use it to help us understand and predict patterns of disease at these big scales, right? How diseases spread across entire continents or across different populations within a country. And sort of how important actually are climate and ecological drivers? Do these really explain global patterns of disease? Or are sort of human factors, like sort of economic factors or people's behaviors more important? And the way that we do this is through data science. So what we basically do, I and my research group at UCL, we assemble huge databases where we connect up information on global patterns of human and animal disease in different places and times, with landscape data that's been measured from satellites that orbit the Earth, with climate data from sophisticated models of the Earth system, and long-term data on monitoring of wildlife populations to understand where these things are. And these data sets are super big, they're messy, and sometimes sort of searching for this signal of climate or ecology within this feels I imagine it would feel like to sort of be searching for other solar systems through a telescope, right? It's really hard. So what we actually end up doing is more like detective work, right? It's sort of statistical detective work. You can think a bit about the board game Cluedo, right? Where what we're trying to do is we're trying to assemble clues and say who done it and where and how. And so we use sort of carefully designed statistics to try and identify this sort of fingerprint of climate and ecology within patterns of disease. Only instead of, it's Colonel Mustard with a lead pipe in the ballroom, it's like the rodent in the agricultural field during the heat wave. So I wanted to, as we come to the end, sort of give you just one specific example of the kinds of things we can discover when we take this kind of big data approach to climate and disease. So a few years ago, I worked with public health scientists in Vietnam and at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine here to study how climate change might be impacting dengue fever, which I mentioned earlier. So this is becoming a much more of a prevalent public health threat in the country, particularly in urbanizing areas which are very suitable for the mosquito that likes to transmit it. And the way that we answered this question was to take all of the data that had been collected from hospitals on human dengue cases since the late 90s in every district in the country, so loads of information. And when we map it all out, as you can sort of see on the left here, where the brighter colors are places where there's more disease, and when we plot it over time, these graphs over time, as you can see for the south and the central and the northern regions, what we can see is that dengue's long been a major historical problem in the south, where it's warm and tropical and very suitable for the disease to transmit. But over recent years, we've seen this shift where in the central and the northern regions, there are more and more outbreaks happening. We wanted to know, is climate playing a role? So we brought together this information with lots of detailed data on the climate at the same place and time, and did some careful statistical trickery, and came up with a couple of interesting answers that I just wanted to share with you. And the first is this, which I still think is really interesting. So what this graph is showing you is basically how the rate at which dengue spreads in a population depends on the temperature. So as the temperature gets warmer, the speed of dengue spreading among people is getting faster, but crucially up to a point where it starts to drop, right? And the attentive among you may notice that this almost exactly mirrors the shape that I showed you from earlier in the lab where we look at mosquito biology, right? So this is basically exactly what we predict based on mosquito biology. And I still think this is incredible, right? That you can go from understanding that you have in a lab, and then you look at the data from humans across a whole country, across a 25-year span, and we can basically see the same pattern, this pattern that I would observe just by sitting in my garden, actually determines how fast diseases spread across entire populations. The second thing is that we found that temperature affects, temperature has actually warmed Vietnam enough that climate is driving dengue to increase. So these areas in darker red basically show areas where warming has driven the disease up. So rather than being a sort of historical problem, this is something that's happening in the now. And so I'd like to end by sort of shifting back from that global picture to the heatwave mosquitoes in my garden. So when I started my career in this field a little over a decade ago, climate change was still very much being discussed as an emerging problem for the future rather than a health problem of now, right? And quite clearly, given the events of the last week, this view is now untenable. And one thing I think that hopefully we can all take away from that is that it's incumbent on all of us who all have a stake in this planet's future to really fight for the political and social action that we need on the climate. But in the meantime, the goal of the science that I and others do, this is to help us really anticipate what the new threats might be and how we could tackle them. So we're really fortunate in the UK right now in that a bite from a mosquito in our gardens is unlikely to pose a risk to our health. But this is actually really quickly changing as the temperature in the UK is warming. So just in recent years, we've seen the emergence of a mosquito-borne virus called Usutu, which is starting to impact blackbird populations here. And just last year, its much nastier cousin, West Nile virus, which can cause severe disease in people, was detected for the first time in a UK mosquito. So these are not problems of the future, and they are not problems of other places. They're problems of now that we need to work together to tackle. And this is very much a challenge of international scientific solidarity. And there are many, many minds that are needed to address this problem. And I sort of hope that many of the younger people in the audience might draw a little bit of inspiration from how important this work is. So thank you, and looking forward to speaking with you.
So we do have time for some questions. If anyone has their hand up, please wait for the microphone for it to come to you.
How does climate change affect our mental health, and does that have a link with the physical state?
That is a really great and a really huge question. So I'll try and answer it in as sort of succinct a way as possible. There's a lot of evidence around, well, I guess there's sort of two things, right? There are the ways that actually the physical experience of climate change can affect our mental health, right? And so thinking about the sort of psychological consequences of living through heat waves, the psychological consequences of the sort of degradation of our environments. And then I guess there's also the challenge of climate anxiety, right? Which is like how much actually the knowledge of living in the world as it is now is impacting people's mental health. So there's a sort of huge research field where people are trying to understand that. I actually don't know the full extent of that. That's sort of not what I work on. But in terms of the consequences, I mean, what we see in terms of how different populations are differentially affected by diseases. If you think about COVID, there were certain groups of people who are more likely to get sicker than others, right? And a lot of the time that's actually determined by social factors, right? It's like other diseases that people might have, whether that might be diabetes or whether that might be other conditions. And so there are ways that these other indirect impacts of climate change, like on mental health, can actually determine how bad being infected by a disease could be. Yeah.
Do you think that we can still reverse the effects of climate change, or do you think we need to develop some solutions to live with these raises of rates?
That's a really good question. I think the answer has got to be both and, right? I think we're in a circumstance where it's very clear that we urgently need action to mitigate climate change, and every degree of warming that's prevented really, really matters in terms of our health, but in terms of so many other things as well. I do think that we are in a situation now with the climate as it is, and with how much warming that's already baked in, that we also need to be thinking seriously about how to adapt, right? And so in the UK, just thinking about the heat wave last week, right? That's about how do we design our urban infrastructure and kind of redesign our urban infrastructure so that we can cope better with that. And for diseases, it's things like how do we build systems where we can collect data, where we can monitor the right species, collect mosquitoes, make sure we're keeping track of what diseases are arriving, and make sure that we develop the right kind of vaccines and the right sort of treatments for people who get them. Yeah.
Hi, Rory. What do you think about this research that lots of organizations seem to be doing about sort of genetically modifying mosquitoes so that they can't breed, they can't pass on the genes, or their inability to cause the kind of diseases you're talking about? So rather than looking at a solution at the environmental level, looking at the solution at the biological level, at the mosquitoes that pass on the diseases?
This work is really, really interesting, right? I think, so with my ecologist hat on, which sort of says that interactions between species matter, and the long and sort of sad history of biological interventions is that they often have unintended consequences, is that I think that whenever you're intervening like genetically in an ecosystem, I think it makes a lot of sense to be very cautious about that. And so I think there are reservations that ecologists have, especially around like what some of the implications might be of driving certain mosquito populations out of the, say out of ecosystems. The flip side to that is that some of these technologies do seem like they have the potential to be really effective. And so I think like with that idea of, do we mitigate climate change or do we adapt to it? I think it's probably a matter of actually considering all of these as a sort of a suite of things that we could potentially do. And in places where, so I mean, a good example of this would be actually not the kind of genetic modification, but there's been some really successful field trials done of mosquitoes that are infected with a bacterium called Wolbachia, which basically blocks the mosquito from effectively transmitting viruses. So it doesn't actually remove the mosquitoes from the environment, but when the mosquitoes are affected with Wolbachia, it does a really good job of reducing how effectively they can transmit viruses like dengue. And there's been some field trials of that in Indonesia, for example, that have shown that that's actually massively reduced dengue within areas where that field trial has been done. So there are ways that this kind of biological knowledge of sort of, infections of mosquitoes might help us to control these things in ways that hopefully will be part of a wider set of things that we can do.